Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're looking at the Massdrop Airist R2R DAC, which is a resistor ladder style DAC, more of the old-fashioned style of decoding of digital audio, but a very popular style of decoding with certain people, particularly those that prefer that richer, warmer sound similar to analog. Now, I've personally been a fan of R2R DACs for a while now. I've been using the Galvanic multi-bit, which is also an R2R style DAC. I love it for its warmth and its very natural analog sound, but I'm also aware that different people have different tastes. So I was really keen to try a different style of R2R DAC and see how it stacked up against some other options in the market, such as the recently reviewed Topping D50S. So I'm going to chat about that specific comparison later on in this review, but also talk about the R2R for its own merits as well. Now, this DAC is a collaboration between a company called Airist and Massdrop. Airist are known for their amplifier known as the Heron. I haven't personally heard it, so I can't comment to it, but it does have some very good reviews floating around the internet. So this is a collaboration, meaning that Airist to provide the technical know-how, Massdrop have provided the input as to the way it should look, the way it should sound, the tuning of the DAC, etc., to hopefully produce something that's going to be popular amongst their followers. So I was really keen to check it out, particularly knowing that I had a reference point in the Galvanic multi-bit, and also because at $350 US, the price for this is really cheap for an R2R DAC. Before I go any further, let's talk a bit about what that means, this R2R DAC, multi-bit, etc. What does this all mean? So most DACs you're familiar with will use a chip similar to a Sabre chip, a Cirrus Logic chip, maybe an AKM chip, or chips, sometimes it's dual chips. And what they're doing is they're taking the signal and converting it into a series of pulses that represent the audio signal. And I'm not going to get into the detail here, A, because I'm not an audio engineer, but also because it would make this a very long video. So instead, I'm going to really simplify this just enough to explain the difference between R2R, or ladder DACs as they're sometimes known, and a Delta Sigma DAC as the traditional chip style DACs are known. So when a Delta Sigma DAC is working, the signal comes in and it's essentially upsampled. It's converted from, say, a 16-bit or a 24-bit signal into a 1-bit signal for the purpose of the processing and then conversion into analog sound. In the case of an R2R DAC, or what's sometimes known as a ladder DAC or a non-oversampling DAC or NOS DAC, what's happening is the digital signal is being directly converted from digital into analog, and it does that through a series of resistors. The principle behind this and the theory behind why some people prefer it is there's less manipulation of the digital signal. Now, some will say that's a great thing, others will say it's not a good thing. I'm not going to get into the debate of which one's good or which one's bad. I'm just here to talk about how this sounds, whether I like it, whether I think other people will like it. But it's important to understand what the difference is so you can help make up your own mind as to whether this is the right product for you. It's worth pointing out that R2R DACs traditionally measure very poorly. For a variety of reasons, the distortion figures and the noise figures from R2R DACs are generally much poorer than those from the Delta Sigma type conversion. Again, I'm not going to say which one is better or worse, but what I will point out is that it's very easy for Delta Sigma conversion to measure well, whereas it's much harder for R2R to measure well. Whether or not that converts into better sound quality at a subjective level, I'm going to leave up to you, and I'm going to share my impressions having listened to this DAC up against multiple other Delta Sigma DACs, so you can have a sense for yourself as to whether this suits your sound taste. Now, I should also mention before continuing on that this DAC is going to be given away after this review. So if you'd like to be in the running, make sure you stick around to the end to find out how you could win this DAC, but also other products that I'm going to review in the future and then be giving away afterwards. The design of the R2R is very much in keeping with the Massdrop style of design language. So it's the same chassis size, shape, color, detailing as things like the THX+N amplifier, and also some of the Cavalli Massdrop collaboration amplifiers that have come out in the past. So it fits in really nicely as a nice sleek desktop stack solution if you choose this as your DAC to go along with something like the THX+N amplifier. Overall, it's a very simple design. You've got just two buttons on the front, you've got your power switch, and you've got your input selector switch. There's also a tiny little hole here that you probably can't see on the video, but that's the indicator light light, which is either red or white depending on whether there's signal coming through. Now this threw me once. I thought there was an error with the DAC. I'm used to a red light meaning that there's an error and that there's not a connection with the computer or the source. What it actually means in this case is whether there's signal coming through. So do be aware of that if you do buy one of these. When it's connected to your computer, if there's no sound coming through, the indicator light will be red. As soon as sound comes through, the indicator light will turn white. So it doesn't mean there's an issue. I was unplugging it, replugging it, trying to work out if there were drivers required, which there aren't. But what it turns out is that it's just the way the light works. Red is no signal coming through, white is signal coming through. While we're on the front panel, I also want to mention that I'm not a huge fan of the input selector switch. It's a bit spongy, there's not a lot of feedback about it. I'm not a huge fan of that. I would have preferred a clear click from it, but it's a really minor issue. It doesn't feel like it's going to break. There's no major problems with it. I just don't like the tactile feedback that it gives me. Flipping around to the back now, you'll see that we've got just simple single-ended outputs. We've got an optical input, coaxial input, we've got USB, and we've got the power input as well. So there's no extra bells and whistles. It's a pretty no-frills DAC, and it just does what it's meant to do. For the price point, it's everything that you'd expect. One thing I do think is a little bit disappointing is that the power pack uses a specific plug, being the US plug. So if you're in any country other than the US that uses a different kind of socket, you're going to have a really bulky power adapter to deal with. So that's a bit of a shame. I do think it would have been good if they could have used a power brick with a separate figure 8 lead coming from it, just to allow people to change out the plugs as needed. Again, it's a minor point, but it is a bit of a hassle having to have a big chunky power pack with an adapter sticking out of your wall. Coming back around when we're talking about design, the ability for Massdrop and Airist to put together a DAC that uses a resistor ladder approach at this price point is pretty incredible. The reason for that is that to do an R2R DAC, what has to happen is you have to have perfectly matched resistors at a range of different impedances. So for each resistance level, the two resistors, left and right channel, have to be perfectly aligned so that when the voltage from the signal gets fed to them, it's converted effectively and is matched for the left and the right channel. So for them to do that for $350 is really impressive, but also raised questions for me of how good it was going to be, given that traditionally anything that's multi-bit, R2R, ladder, non-oversampling, all those terms essentially mean the same thing, that's normally been an expensive DAC. So to see it at $350, I was very curious to see how it would stack up. But I also figured that for Massdrop to release it, it wasn't going to be rubbish. And so the question for me was that going to be the case? My initial impressions of the sound quality are that it's extremely natural and extremely smooth. The sound is a bit warm, it's very analog for want of a better term, and I found it personally quite enjoyable. Some people may find it a touch too warm, particularly if you're used to a Delta Sigma DAC, an ESS Sabre chip for instance. This is going to seem a lot warmer than that at first listen. And I'm going to compare it to a couple of other DACs in a moment, just to give you an idea of how that stacks up in real world listening situations, because something being warm does not always mean thick and does not always mean veiled. It can actually just be a different presentation of the sound. And in this case, I believe that it is. One thing that did really stand out to me about the sound though, was that the soundstage from the R2R DAC has a great sense of depth to it. So it's both got good width, but much better depth than a lot of other DACs that I've tried. And I do consistently find that to be something that I notice between Delta Sigma DACs and R2R DACs, is that often the R2R produces a better sense of depth and space in the soundstage, whereas a lot of the Delta Sigmas tend to be more left-right focused without that same sense of depth. So that's something I really enjoyed about this. As always, I tested both USB and also coaxial because I do find there's sometimes a difference there, and I'd say that the coaxial was slightly smoother. Whether that's a good thing for a DAC that's already quite warm is really up to the individual. It does suggest that possibly the coaxial is removing a little bit of noise from the system that might be coming through the USB circuit. But having said that, the difference wasn't night and day, and I wouldn't say you've got to use this with coaxial or you've got to use it with USB. I think both are fine. There wasn't a night and day difference, but there was a subtle difference going to the coaxial. So I think the most effective way to put a DAC into the context of your audio listening experience is to put it up against other sounds that you might already know, or other sounds that a reviewer might have checked out before. And so in this case, I want to talk about it in comparison to the Topping D50S that I just reviewed recently, and also the Shitgunnier multi-bit that I've been using for a few years now. So starting with the Topping D50S, there's about $100 difference in price between the two. That's $100 difference in price. And part of that would obviously be down to the technology. As I mentioned before, it is more expensive to do R2R than it is to do a Delta Sigma chip. The D50S offers you a lot more flexibility. It's got different filters, it's got Bluetooth input, it's got a variable volume, including a remote control. So it's got a lot of things going for it that the R2R doesn't offer. So for that extra $100, the R2R really has to stack up in sound quality. And to my mind, it does. It doesn't measure as well. In fact, measurement-wise, these two couldn't be further apart. The measurements for the R2R look particularly poor. The measurements for the D50S look exceptional. These are not my measurements, by the way. These are measurements on the internet. I can post a link down below to those measurements, but I want to point out that measurements are not the be-all and end-all. In the end, it has to come down to how much you enjoy the sound of a product. And that's why I want to describe these two and not just rely on the measurements so you can work out which one you're going to prefer. Immediately what I noticed going from the D50S to the R2R was that the R2R was smoother and actually had more detail retrieval than the D50S. Now that detail retrieval comes across through the mid-range in terms of the layering and the texture of the sounds. The D50S may initially seem to be more detailed because it's a little bit brighter, but in actual fact I was hearing things from the R2R that I was not hearing from the D50S. And my assumption is that's probably due to the way the two different DACs are handling transients in the sound. So it's not necessarily about the sound signature of the DAC so much as the way it's handling the decoding and the recreation of that audio signal accurately. As I've already touched on, the R2R is also very three-dimensional and therefore a more three-dimensional sound than the D50S. The D50S produces a great soundstage, it's got good width, but it doesn't go particularly deep. The R2R, on the other hand, gives you that extra sense of depth in the soundstage, which to me makes for a more realistic listening experience overall. Ultimately, what I found was that the R2R was a more nuanced and elegant presentation of the sound, whereas the D50S comes across as just doing a technical reproduction of the audio. And that's generally been my experience of Delta Sigma DACs versus R2R DACs, putting aside obviously the measurement question, and that's a whole different debate. The other comparison that I made was much more of a similar comparison in the sense that I put the Shitgun-Near multibit, or the Gumby as it's often known, next to the R2R. Now both use the ladder style approach. The Gun-Near multibit is a much more expensive DAC at up around a couple of $1,000s, so there's a big difference in price. What I found between the two though was that the tonality of the two was extremely similar. So flicking back and forth between the two of them with matched volume, what I was finding was it was very difficult to tell which was which based on tonality. They both had that same analog warmth, the same sense of 3D spaciousness. And so in that regard, if you're a fan of the shit multibit sound, you're going to be absolutely a fan of the R2R. Where I found the differences was that, as you'd expect, the Gumby was better in its refinement, its layering, and its detail retrieval in the sound. So each sound had a bit more weight and a bit more definition, so you could sort of have a sense of more three-dimensionality in the sound in the Gumby's representation, whereas the R2R was a little bit more squashed and compressed sounding. The result of that is that the Gumby also sounds more effortless and is overall a more enjoyable, relaxing, and ultimately engaging listen. Now all of these comments are based on the single-ended output from the Gumby and the single-ended, which is the only choice, output from the R2R. The moment I moved to the balanced outputs from the Gumby, it was a whole different ballgame, and the Gumby was just way ahead. Much better levels of detail retrieval, separation, soundstage size and depth and clarity was all improved over balanced. So we're talking here single-ended against single-ended. There's a level of comparability, even though the Gumby is still noticeably better in those terms of detail retrieval and refinement of sound. What that means though is that if you've ever heard a shit multi-bit DAC, such as the Gumby, or maybe the Bimby, which is the Bifrost multi-bit, you'll probably find if you enjoyed that, you'll really enjoy the R2R as well. So this is a really interesting product to me. As I said before, the measurements make this look atrocious. So much so that I did my original listening before I saw the measurements. I then saw the measurements and thought I must have heard it wrong, and I came back and I re-listened to this expecting it to be bad, expecting to hear things that I'd missed the last time. But the reality is, it's an enjoyable sounding DAC. It's not the last word in transparency. It's not going to blow you out of the water in terms of its detail retrieval, but it's going to give you a really nice three-dimensional sound with a good sense of space and layering. And for me, I would compare it to maybe a great digital recording compared to a good vinyl recording. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the debate around which one's better or which one's worse. There's evidence that vinyl can't produce some of the levels of detail of digital in terms of its dynamic range, the fact that the bass is compressed into a mono signal. There's multiple factors there that on paper say that vinyl should not be as good as digital. But that doesn't change the fact that a lot of people out there love vinyl. And that's where I'd say the R2R sits as well. On paper, it's not as good as something like the topping D50S. But the reality is, if I had the two of them sitting in front of me and I was purely judging them on sound quality, I'd choose the R2R because it's a more enjoyable and engaging sound. So I'd encourage anyone thinking about buying a DAC at the moment, if you're looking at options like the D50S and the R2R, have a think about what matters to you. Don't get caught up in the measurements. Have a think about, what sound style do I like? Do I want warmth and musicality, or do I want more of a pure analytical sound? It's very important, I believe, that we go with our tastes and our ears, not just what's on paper in measurements. Take the measurements into account for sure, but then also think about what your preferences and tastes are. I need to then temper that comment by also saying that some would question, is the DAC the place to bring colouring into the system? Should your amplifier and your headphone be the place for the colouring, or should the DAC be doing some of that? And that's a whole nother debate again. Personally, I like to try different pieces in my system, whether it's amplifiers, DACs, headphones, and just see what I like the most and stick with what I like the most. So from that point of view, I encourage people to try stuff, experiment, move on gear that you don't like, bring in new gear that you do like, until you find what really works for you. And that's where I think the R2R is really going to excel for some people. They're going to get it in their system, they're going to really enjoy how it sounds, and it's going to stick around with them for quite some time. So if the R2R sounds like a DAC that you might be interested in, if you enjoy that more analog, engaging, enjoyable sound, then there's a couple of things you can do. One of them is that I'll put a link to Massdrop down below. You can click through and you can buy the R2R for yourself, or you could also join our Patreon program, where you'll then have a chance to actually win this DAC for yourself. Now, to join up, there are multiple tiers available, and 2 of the tiers have a chance to win the gear after it's reviewed. On that note, I would like to thank our first ever Patreon, Ainsley, for joining the channel, supporting the channel, and he's obviously already in the running for this R2R DAC. On that note, Ainsley, to say thank you to you for being our first Patreon, I've also got a little gift that I'll be sending out to you in the next week or so, something that I hope will help you enjoy your music experience even more than you currently are. I'll be in touch with you separately to arrange that. Now, there's going to be plenty more giveaways in the future, as well as the Passion for Sound gear tour, where you can actually get a chance to listen to gear for 2 weeks before sending it on to somebody else. So do check out the Patreon page from the link below, and hit the subscribe button so you can see the future videos where I'll talk about which gear is available for loan and which gear is available for giveaway. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.